Trudi, what needs to happen to fix this?
So we've had a decade like that. If you think about the late 2000s into the early 2010s, before we had the 2014 kind of change. So we can do this. We have experience in doing this. I mean, if we think about the sad news that you shared this morning around former Finance Minister Mboweni. One of the things he would often say is that if you look at 1994, when that administration came into power, is the sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay. When that administration came into power and South Africa was junk-rated, public finance were completely a disaster. There were like different homeland systems that had to be integrated and all that. And within a space of 10, 15 years, South Africa had achieved investment grade.
Yeah.
And then, of course, then we lost it. So there's this cycle that we need to get back into believing that we can actually achieve great things and have that ambition. And if we look at what needs to be done, you mentioned the ease of doing business, for instance. I sit on the economic advisory panel for the president of the World Bank. And he was talking about how they want to revitalize that study. And the one change that they want to do, which is very important, is that they want it to be about countries coming up with their own agenda about what needs to change for their own context. Because it used to be very competitive, etc., which is important. But the idea of local ownership, in a sense that these are the kinds of things we need to do to achieve reforms, is very important. So if you look at our reform program, Operation Vulindlela, which is continuing under this administration, you see the seeds of the things that need to be done. So if I zoom in on energy, for instance, yes, it's great 201 days without load shedding, but that started with things like lifting the threshold for people to be able to invest in private generation. It began with reducing red tape for registration and licensing. It was about trying to help municipalities to think about how they can incentivize rooftop solar. So there are lots of small regulatory things that need to add up to enable a market. I think energy, telecoms, logistics, water infrastructure have in common this feature that they, across the world, in most modern economies, they used to be run by the state. One huge monopoly did everything. But from the 70s, 80s, competition came in. But then for competition to come in, it's not just about going to investors and saying, here's an opportunity, we want your returns. You have to change the playing field, because otherwise the monopoly will continue having the advantage. So things like removing the cap, things like ensuring that there's an independent transmission entity that looks at system operation and makes sure that if you've got multiple generators, the best generator will be the one that gets to deploy energy, not necessarily the state-owned entity. So all of that has to happen, because I think of these network industries as post-monopoly. And a post-monopoly market structure is different from a market structure that grew up as a competitive market structure. Because in hotels, we don't need to think about, how does Hilton compare with the state-owned monolith that has hotels in every town? There's no such question. Competition kind of just runs along. But where there was a state monopoly, in this post-monopolistic environment, you need all of this soft legislative and regulatory work to make it happen. And as I say, with Operation Vulindlela, I think some of that has happened. We've seen some successes in various industries, setting up a water regulator, trying to separate regulation of ports and operations. So all of that is happening. I think the point is we actually know what needs to happen. It's about accelerating the pace of that reform, because if I think about in telecoms, for instance, getting digital migration, we're almost there, but it took like over a decade. Auctioning spectrum, we did it, but it also took a long time. So I think if we learn that we just need to do things 6 months, a month, the auction spectrum actually, when it really came down to it, was a 6-month process. So we really need to think about how we accelerate, draw in the private sector to help to accelerate, but do it in a way that is also opening up the market to competition. And I think, once again, if you go back to the energy example, it's not just about opening up competition to multinationals, international IPPs, etc. A lot of these markets also have scope for a lot of SMME activity. We see it in rooftop solar, where there's a whole value chain that includes installers, maintenance, etc. Energy efficiency. Gauteng is an industrial hub with so many industrial conglomerations that could be revitalized. And in doing that, energy efficiency, retrofitting buildings, analyzing systems, all of that is SMME work on the main. So there's actually scope to really drive a green industrialization process from these changes. So we not only achieve energy security, but we do it in a way that enables local production. I think the trick, though, is that the local production has to be competitive. And sometimes we fall into the trick of having a big stick to say this has to be local without thinking about how we make it competitive so that we're not kind of almost canceling out the benefits of the processes that we're in. So, I mean, in short, I would say we shouldn't be complacent, but we see that the seeds of reform are there. We need to invest more in that reform process. We need to give more political support to it. And I think we also need business coming in to elevate those efforts where appropriate. To conclude, particularly on the Gauteng point, I think municipalities and metros have a very important role to play. And there's lots of capacity building that's happening out there to help them to develop infrastructure pipelines, to incentivize certain kinds of behavior, to get some governance stability going. And I think that's really where the rubber's going to hit the road. And governance stability is something that obviously we should all worry about, because when we have these changes that really cause uncertainty, that doesn't help to make the local story compelling.